And when I graduated from Penn State, I was hired by the Girl Scout Council of Anne Arundel County as a field director, as a district director. The training that I got with the Girl Scouts was probably the best training I've ever had. And it was all about participatory democracy. It was all about engaging people in decision making and collaboration. And so, and that's far more typical of a style, if you will, that women use anyway than men use. I was always involved. I was involved from the time I was 5 years old when we moved to Towson. I'd always organize the neighbors, my age, my group, and we would do plays in my basement at the house, etc. And then in high school, I was a leader in high school. So I've always been engaged in doing things and largely trying to bring people together. I was married to Pip Moyer, who was a young mayor in this city. So I was a first lady, but I was, front and center in doing things back then in the 1960s. I was just engaged in the community. I was engaged in the arts and in environmental issues, things that were the initiatives that led to programs that we kind of take for granted now. What is this, 60 years later, as a part of the fabric of the city, were things that I was engaged in and initiating. Well, there had to be some education, but but Annapolis has been for a long time, and I hope still is, more environmentally sensitive than many other communities. So what we proposed was to do an outreach program. It wasn't going to cost a whole lot of money. We did want to be covered for our gas and traveling expenses, but we would go out as ambassadors and talk with our peers in other places and show them how they could begin to do some things that did not cost a fortune. I mean, this city had already some of it, my legislation, established an urban land trust, the only one in the country, a public urban land trust. And we had promoted rain gardens. And we had done all of these kinds of things to recapture that were primarily, and trees. We had more people planting trees. We created a program called Greenscape, now in its close to 35th year, where people in communities came out and planted trees and plants, etc. And plus we had legislation that I sponsored in the 1980s, way back then, when nobody was talking trees, to protect the tree canopy. These things did not cost an arm and a leg. They weren't the big dollar projects. They were the little things that everybody could do. You could plant a tree and, oh, that's my tree. You could work with your neighbor in developing a rain garden in your own backyard. And so we wanted to go out and talk with our peers about how they could begin to do some things that would make a difference. Look, I love professionals and bureaucrats. They have a very important job and a tough job to do. But what they do not understand is that a lot of these campaigns, if you want to energize the public, it's a political campaign. It takes a lot of nurturing. It's time-consuming and nurturing, and that's not the job that professionals in the departments that deal with the environment want to do. Occasionally an event, a speaking engagement, but that's not what energizes people. Every one person that you can convince through community groups to go out and plant a tree, it becomes a new advocate for the environment. Well, the Maritime Museum is a different kind of it's a different kind of a thing, because it was property that was privately owned, and there was as you know, an oyster house on the last oyster house on the western shore, out of many. You're from the eastern shore, and in the East End and St. Michael, so the many oyster houses that used to be on this bay. And it was waterfront property, and part of the city's comprehensive plan urged the city to acquire as much as it could on the water. I was an alderman at the time, And so I pushed for acquiring that property. And we did with the very first open space grant, that $250,000 that was ever dedicated in an urban environment. Now, $250,000 at that point in time could purchase a lot of acres if you went west. But this was the first time it was used in an urban environment. I had also had a history before that when I was a first lady of working to acquire our street ends as access to the water. Today we've got 22 of our street ends are street end parks. One of the things that we did during my administration was that we did a whole series of collaborative meetings. Collaboration, it was a corporate model actually. You brought people together to solve problems, and then you'd come back 3 months later and evaluate what you could do and what you couldn't do and where the barriers were. So we brought 10 people who were residents, 10 people from the police department that served a particular area, and 10 businesses together in different communities. The first one was the Clay Street community. And they were individually, they were facilitated by a professional facilitator. Out of that particular program became a fairly aggressive program in dealing with crime in the streets. Residents were given old cell phones so they could, with a direct link to the police department, so they could call. And then another group had a radio station for the immediate area, and residents who lived in the area, like Robert Eads, who is no longer with us, would come in and broadcast in that area. And then they began to propose, okay, how can we share and do things together? First Sundays, which is a big event in this city, grew out of that dialogue next level. So that was a process that we used. We used it in Eastport, not as quite successfully. We used it out at Admiral Drive in that area. And we also had a number of collaboration meetings that had to do with historic preservation. It was a tough time for this historic preservation. People were making fun of, this isn't important. Oh, you're talking about, rose bushes, fake rose bushes. No. There's a whole lot more to it. And so we had a series of conversations, public participation conversations about that whole issue. So those were some of the kinds of outreach stuff that we did. Greenscape was probably the largest community participation project. We had usually about 1,000 people, residents, that would, they had developed, and that meant 50 or 60 community or neighborhood groups that were participating to plant trees, plant gardens, et cetera. And the city supported all of those ventures. When I took office, let's just talk about public safety and the police department. When I took office, police officers new recruits were coming into the city to be trained, and then they would go away. They'd go to another jurisdiction because we didn't have the salary or the benefits to keep them, to keep them here. We also needed a new police station. Remember, I was elected on 9/11, and the primary of 9/11. So we established for the first time an emergency office that was connected then to the fire department and Homeland Security. We negotiated increased salaries and increased benefits to the point that our police department was in the top 3, depending on how you measured it. It might have been 1, 2, or 3 of all the police departments in the state. And we kept our officers. We had good officers, and we had community outreach. And we completed the new police department, enlarged police department that also housed the emergency management office. The other thing, and I had Mike Meyer as my economic development director, we moved to a AA+ bond rating. You know, a lot of people like to say, oh, you know, Ellen spent all our money. Well, I didn't spend all your money. I achieved a AA plus bond rating. I don't know what it is this year because of all of the, you know, the coronavirus, but it has never, even in bad times, faltered. I also, for which the opposition party never wanted to credit me, reduced during those tough times the tax rate by 9.1 cents. And then I was able to continue and on the trek that I had begun 40 years earlier relative to environmental programs and to the arts. I had, as an alderman, initiated a program for art in public places. We were the second one in the state, Rockville being first, way ahead of us, but we were the second one to begin that program. And all of the murals that you see downtown were done under my under my administration because we had some money, you know, to make them happen. And we did a lot in terms of developing groups of people who could, you know, Steve Carr was our environmental guru, and we set up meetings in each of the creeks, much like this collaborative stuff that I had talked about before, you know, with the stakeholders along the creeks to determine for your creek what are the things we need to do. And out of that was developed the Spot Creek Conservancy. We have always been ahead. You know, we established a fee for the bay, right? What the county used to like to call the rain tax. We did that before the county did it. We did it before the state did it. Do we get much credit for it? No, because municipalities are not so important in our governance system. They ought to be more important in our governance recognition than they are. It's the counties that get everything. But yeah, no, we were there on that issue way before. When we did our comprehensive plan, I engaged you know, representatives and members of each of the housing neighborhoods to be engaged and involved and offer into our comprehensive plan things that they thought were important. I think this city has, you know, a good history of being inclusive. And, you know, I'd like to think they were. No, they were under Pip Moyer's administration, and I'd like to believe that they were under my administration. There is a wisdom among Americans that prods the issues relative to civility and fairness, you know, and sociability and justice. That the kinds of things that help make us great in the past will not be lost. So I see those things coming back. Now, do we have a lot of meanness around us? Yeah, every age has some meanness. We have probably a higher percent. We need to reduce that percent. But to reduce it, it's up to each one of us to think through what makes us angry. And, you know, why do we hate? And how can we overcome that? Because that's not healthy. You know, there's that old thing called the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Just think what a world would be like if we lived by that.